This essay will be addressing to what extent King Louis XVI was a bad leader, and it will be addressing primary and secondary resources based on King Louis XVI being a bad leader. The main arguments of this essay are how King Louis XVI was a weak king. King Louis XVI was also an arrogant king, and many more attributes that will be discussed in this essay. From these attributes is what led to his downfall and what led to the revolution. The French Revolution was where the poor fought for liberty and equality. They did this because they lived in horrible conditions and had no money due to most of their money going towards taxation due to the country being in severe debt. The French Revolution started on July 14, 1789 to 1799. It started in Bastille due to there being gun ammunition the peasants could use to attack the French monarchy and overthrow the government. During the French Revolution, 40,000 people died during the revolution. Another name for it was called the Reign of Terror. This expression was used due to how much bloodshed was shown during the French Revolution. From this, you should get an idea of the basics of the French Revolution and why the French people did what they did. King Louis XVI, also known as Louis August, which was his birth name, was born on August 23rd, 1754, at the Palace of Versailles. He was the second son of Louis Dauphin at the time of his birth. He was third in line of the throne. His father and older brother were ahead of him. He had 8 siblings where he was the second oldest. His life changed when his older brother got TB in 1761, and his father later died in 1765. He was a 10-year-old prince, heir to the throne of Bourbon. King Louis XV died in 1774, who was his granddad, which left him ruler at the age of 19 to rule France. At the age of 16, King Louis got married to Marie Anatolie, who was 15 at the time. So when he became in charge of the country, they had an 18-year-old queen and a 19-year-old king ruling one of the most powerful empires in the world. As you would expect, it didn't go so well. From this, you should have an idea of who King Louis XVI was. To what extent was King Louis XVI a bad leader? King Louis XVI was in charge before the French Revolution went down. He was an immature king. At the age of 19, he became King of France. He wasn't confident with any decisions he made because he was a young king and didn't know how the French people would react with his decisions. He wanted to become a good king, but he didn't know how to. He said things, but he didn't act on any decisions he made. After becoming king, he already had debts from King Louis XIV due from the 7-Year War between France and Britain. Later, King Louis XVI came to reign, and during his reign, he supported the American Revolution in 1778. But the Treaty of Paris in 1783 yielded the French little, which made the country's debt even bigger. From this, the government was forced to increase taxes, which made the French peasants angry due to already being poor. King Louis XVI didn't know what else to do. Throughout King Louis XVI's reign, there were multiple accounts of first-hand letters and quotes by the people around him. Florimond Claude was the Austrian minister in Paris from 1766 to 1790. His job was to strengthen the alliance between Austria and France. A statement he made about King Louis XVI was he will probably never have the strength or the will to rule on his own. Florimond didn't just say these things, he had a valid point of view from his experience in being the ambassador for Austria. He knew that being a young leader and not being fully developed physically and mentally, it was going to end in disaster. His statement suggests that King Louis XVI should have not have been king at such a young age. This quote is reliable due to being accurate and multiple sources backing it up, and what it says. The usefulness of this quote helps address the question and gives me a primary account of what people thought of King Louis XVI. Hilary Balloch was a French-born British historian and author active in the first half of the 20th century. He described King Louis XVI as, "He was one of those men whom you could never by any chance have hoped to convince of anything. The few things which he accepted quite simply." In this secondary quote, Hilary talks about how he's a stubborn man and he doesn't change things even if it was for the best of the country. In this example, it states that he's not a good leader because a good leader is willing to hear ideas from all kinds of people. This quote is reliable due to being accurate about King Louis XVI. The usefulness of this quote helps address the question and gave me a secondary account of what historians thought about King Louis XVI. Another quote about King Louis XVI was by Albert Sobel, who was a historian and focused on the French Revolution. He quotes, "The flight of Varennes had finally torn off the mask and revealed to him in his true colours. The flight of Varennes was where King Louis XVI and his family tried to flee France to counter the revolution. If King Louis XVI was a good leader, he would have stayed and tried to fix France instead of fighting against the army and the revolutionaries, which led to thousands of people dying." From this quote, you can see how King Louis XVI was a coward and is a bad leader for France. This quote is reliable due to being accurate about King Louis XVI and how he tried to flee France. The usefulness of this quote helps address the question and gave me a secondary account on what historians thought of King Louis XVI. Louis XVI and the French Revolution was a book by Alison Johnson. She had an interest in the French Revolution and enjoys hearing about King Louis XVI. This book is a biography of King Louis XVI. Throughout reading this book, Alison Johnson kept referring to the term was a weak king. This phrase has been echoed throughout the book and on the internet. The reason for this is because he failed becoming a good leader. This quote is reliable due to being accurate about King Louis XVI and how he tried to flee France. This book was also published, which will also make it reliable. The usefulness of this quote helps address the question and gives me a secondary account of what historians thought of King Louis XVI. The evidence based on King Louis XVI suggests he wasn't confident with any decisions he made because he was a young king and didn't know how the French people would react with his decisions. He was also a very selfish king in a way. He said, "I have no intention of sharing my authority." He had too many decisions to make, but he didn't want to share his power. Someone equal or a bit lower than him could have helped him a lot and prevented the French Revolution. This quote is reliable due to being accurate about King Louis XVI and how he tried to flee France. The usefulness of this quote helps address the question and gave me a primary account of what kind of things he said. King Louis XVI was in charge of all the decisions for France. Even though he wasn't confident with his decisions, King Louis XVI tried becoming a good king, like most kings, and helped the French people. A quote he said was, "The interest of the state comes first." King Louis XVI says this but does not act on this whatsoever. They lived in posh conditions. Examples of this is having banquets of foods and never being hungry. They also lived in a palace with multiple servants for everything, while the rest of France lived in severe poverty and can barely get enough food to eat. King Louis XVI could have at least acted when he said this. This quote is reliable due to being accurate about King Louis XVI and how much food they had. The usefulness of this quote helps address the question and gave me a primary account of what King Louis XVI was like. Another factor that made him a bad king was his enormous debt. In 3 years of becoming king, the debt went to 300 million euros to 600 million euros and made the French people pay huge taxes due to being in excessive debt, while he and his family lived in royalty. He also failed to successfully address serious problems. An example of him not addressing serious problems was how the rest of the country lived in severe poverty, which he did nothing to fix it because he was living good. In conclusion, this acknowledges how King Louis XVI was a bad leader and how he could have done things differently. From his actions and the way he handled things, he was put to death in 1792 from a guillotine due to the peasants winning the war.